What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is June 28th, 2026, about 10:45 a.m. where I'm at right now. And we are continuing our 22nd book in our Book to React series where we read an entire text cover to cover on live with the people. This is an open source book club, open source library where everybody can come and join in and get in on the conversation and dive into some intellectual works. We are reading Leon Trotsky's The History of the Russian Revolution. And today we are nearing the end of this momentous task, this gargantuan book. We are beginning volume 3. We are beginning volume 3 of Leon Trotsky's 1,000-page tome. And, in the first volume, Trotsky went over, the development of Russia, the history of Russia, et cetera, and also what led up to the February Revolution, the actual February Revolution, and the changes that occurred. Volume 1 so far has been my favorite chapter. There's a lot of insight there, but I believe Volume 2 was incredibly insightful as well. I mean, I love Volume 2. It just gets a little bit more political and a little bit more, intricate when he's laying out the details of how the Russian Revolution was successful against the counter-revolution. Volume 3, I believe, will be about the triumph of the Soviets. I believe that's even the title. Yes, the triumph of the Soviets. And so Trotsky's going to go over in detail, I guess, what led up to the October Revolution, how the October Revolution was so successful, and I'm looking forward to reading about that. So if you haven't been keeping up, I've been posting on my channel, some AI videos summarizing some chapters, particularly the chapters that are more political and analytical, and maybe that might be harder to follow along because these characters Trotsky is talking about are long gone. They're long dead. You know what I mean? So I made those videos to help some people understand the concepts, the events, the time period, and the people that were involved then. If you like those, I'll continue to post those. But, I feel a bit iffy about using AI sometimes when it comes to content like that. I want to try to make, revolutionary theory and, communist history a little bit more accessible to people. So I don't know the right way to do that. I'm still figuring it out. But we're going to continue to try to experiment and find ways to make this information and knowledge accessible to people. So I'm looking forward to hearing from what the people say about that. Sorry for the long intro. I know you're ready to dive into this text. We are just going to be reading chapter 37 today, which is a long chapter. It's about 30 pages or so, so we might be on live for about 2 hours. It's titled The Peasantry Before October. We have both live streams going. We have the horizontal live stream and we have the vertical live stream going. Looking forward to reading comments. Please make sure you pay attention to the pinned comment so that you are able to be a part of the conversation and you will not get blocked or banned. Without further ado, let's jump into it. Chapter 37, The Peasantry Before October. Okay? See, we have to send more people out of here. See, it's very easy. Okay. Chapter 37, The Peasantry Before October. Civilization has made the peasantry its pack animal. The bourgeoisie, in the long run, only changed the form of the pack. Barely tolerated on the threshold of the national life, the peasant stands essentially outside the threshold of science. The historian is ordinarily as little interested in him as the dramatic critic is in those grave figures who shift the scenery, carrying the heavens and earth on their backs, and scrub the dressing rooms of the actors. The part played by the peasantry in past revolutions remains hardly cleared up to this day. The French bourgeoisie began by liberating the peasantry, wrote Marx in 1848. With the help of the peasantry, they conquered Europe. The Prussian bourgeoisie was so blinded by its own narrow and close-by interest that it lost even this ally and turned it into a weapon in the hands of the feudal counter-revolution. In this contrast, what relates to the German bourgeoisie is true, but the assertion that the French bourgeoisie began by liberating the peasantry is an echo of the official French legend, which exercised an influence in its day, even upon Marx. In reality, the bourgeoisie, in the proper sense of the term, opposed the peasant revolution with all the power it had. Even from the rural instructions of 1789, the local readers of the Third Estate threw out, under the guise of editing, the keenest and most bold demands. The famous decision of August 4th, adopted by the National Assembly amid the glow of rural conflagrations, long remained a pathetic formula without content. The peasants who would not reconcile themselves to this deceit were adjured by the Constituent Assembly to return to the fulfillment of their duties and have the proper respect for feudal property. The civil guard tried more than once to put down the peasantry in the country, but the city workers, taking the side of those in revolt, met the bourgeois punitive expeditions with stones and broken tile. So basically, what Trotsky is saying here is that, the peasantry has always been sort of the third wheel of prior revolutions in history. Keep in mind that Marxists generally have a blind spot when they think about slavery and slave revolutions, for example, in Haiti. Is that a working class revolution? Is it a peasant revolution? Is it a proletarian revolution? That's a topic for another day. But when they're thinking about revolutions, they're primarily thinking about the ones in Europe. And the argument that Trotsky is making is that the peasantry has been the backbone of civilization. Literally, they're the people that grow our food and make sure that we're able to sustain and build on top of civilization, but they have never truly been represented. And Trotsky even lays out a criticism of Marx. Marx thought that the bourgeois who had a revolution in France liberated the peasants, and he is saying that is not true. That's absolutely not true. In fact, the peasants were told to go back to their land. Okay, so continuing here. What do you think about that, by the way? If you're watching this right now, what do you think? Do you think the peasantry has ever been liberated in a revolution prior to the Soviet Revolution? Even if we think about the American Revolution, what happened immediately after the American Revolution? We had Bacon's Rebellion, we had Shays' Rebellion. If I'm keeping my timeline right, these were peasant revolutions. These were farmers upset about this new national government who is instituting taxes on them without proper representation. Okay, so continuing here. Throughout 5 years, the French peasantry rose at every critical moment of the revolution, preventing a deal between the feudal and bourgeois property holders. The Parisian sans-culottes, pouring out their blood for the Republic, liberated the peasant from his feudal chains. The French Republic of 1792 marked a new social regime, in contradistinction to the German Republic of 1918 or the Spanish Republic of 1931, which mean only the old regime minus the dynasty. At the bottom of this difference, it is not hard to find the agrarian question. The French peasant did not think directly of a republic. He wanted to throw off the landlord. The Parisian Republicans ordinarily forgot all about the country, but it was only the peasant pressure upon the landlord which guaranteed the creation of a republic, clearing the feudal rubbish out of its road. A republic with a nobility is not a republic. This was excellently understood by the old man Machiavelli, who, in his Florentine exile 400 years before the presidency of Ebert, between hunting thrushes and playing at trick-track with the butcher, generalized the experience of democratic revolutions. Whoever wants to found a republic in a country where there are many nobles can only do this if it, to begin with, he exterminates them all. Let's read that again. This is from Machiavelli. Whoever wants to found a republic in a country where there are many nobles can only do this if, to begin with, he exterminates them all. Okay, so if you want to make a republic, this is early, proto revolutionary theory from, Machiavelli. He's basically saying what us communists say is that if you want to have a democracy, you have to basically kill off the nobles. You have to kill off the people who believe that their right to rule is based upon their grandfather owning the land 100,000 years ago, whatever. Anyway, the Russian muzhiks were essentially of the same opinion, and they revealed this openly without Machiavellianism. While Petrograd and Moscow played the main role in the movement of the workers and soldiers, the first place in the peasant movement must be accorded to the backward Great Russian Agricultural Center in the middle region of the Volga. Here, the relics of serfdom had especially deep roots. The noble's proprietorship in the land was most parasitic in character. The differentiation of the peasantry was far behind, and the poverty of the village thus more nakedly revealed. Bursting out in this region as early as March, the movement had been immediately adorned with acts of terror. Through the efforts of the dominant parties, it was soon switched up, however, into the channel of compromise politics. In the industrially backward Ukraine, agriculture, carried on for export, had acquired a far more progressive and consequently more capitalistic character. Here, the stratification of the peasantry had gone considerably further than in Great Russia. The struggle for national liberation, moreover, inevitably delayed, at least for the time being, other forms of social struggle, but the variation in regional and even national conditions expressed itself in the long run only in a difference of dates. By autumn, the territory of the peasant struggle had become almost the whole country. Out of the 624 counties constituting Old Russia, 482 or 77% were involved in the movement. And omitting the borderlands distinguished by special agrarian conditions, the Northern District, the Transcaucasus, the region of the steppes, and Siberia, out of 481 counties, 439 or 91% were drawn into the peasant revolt. The methods of struggle differ according to whether it is a question of plowed land, forest, pasture, or rentals, or of hired labor. The struggle changed its form and methods too, at various stages of the revolution. But in general, the movement of the villages passed, with inevitable delay, through the same two great stages as the movement of the cities. In the first stage, the peasants were still accommodating themselves to the new regime and trying to solve their problems by means of the new institutions. Even here, however, it was more a matter of form than substance. The Moscow liberal newspaper, tinted before the revolution with a Narodnik hue, expressed with admirable directness the state of mind of the landlord circles in the summer of 1917. The muzhik is glancing around. He is not doing anything yet, but look in his eyes. His eyes will tell you that all the land lying around him is his land. A perfect key to this peaceful policy of the peasantry is a telegram sent in April by one of the Tambov villages to the Provisional Government. We desire to keep the peace in the interest of the freedom won, but for this reason, forbid the sale of the landlords. Land until the Constituent Assembly, otherwise we will shed blood, but we will not let anyone else plow the land. The muzhik found it easy to maintain a tone of respectful threat because, in bringing his presence to bear against historic rights, he hardly had to come into direct conflict with the state at all. Organs of the governmental power were lacking in the localities. The village committees controlled the militia. The courts were disorganized. The local commissars were powerless. We elected you, the peasants would shout at them, and we will kick you out. During the summer, the peasants, developing the struggle of the preceding months, came nearer and nearer to civil war, and their left wing even stepped over its threshold. According to a report of the landed proprietors of the Tangarong district, the peasants, on their own initiative, seized the hay crop, took possession of the land, hindered the plowing, named arbitrary rental prices, and removed proprietors and overseers. According to a report of the Nizhegorod commissar, violent activities and seizures of land and forest in his province were multiplying. The county commissars were afraid of seeming to the peasants like defenders of the big landlords. The rural militia were not to be relied on. There have been cases when officers of the militia took part in violence together with the mob. In Schlusberg County, a local committee prevented the landlords from cutting their own forest. The thought of the peasants was simple. No constituent assembly can resurrect the trees that are cut down. The commissar of the Ministry of the Court complains of the seizure of hay. We have had to buy hay for the court horses. In Kursk province, the peasants divided among themselves the fertilized fallow land of Terashenko. The proprietor was Minister of Foreign Affairs. The peasants declared to Schneider, a horse breeder of Orlov province, that they would not only cut the clover of his estate, but him too. They might send into the army. They might send this guy into the army. The village committee directed the overseer of Rodzianko's estate to surrender the hay to the peasants. If you don't listen to this land committee, you'll get treated different. You'll get arrested. Signed and sealed. Okay? All right, let's go here. From all corners of the country, complaints and wails poured in from victims, from local authorities, from noble minded observers. The telegrams of the landowners constitute a most brilliant refutation of the crude theory of class struggle. These titled nobles, lords of the latifundia, spiritual and temporal rulers, are worrying exclusively about the public weal. Their enemy is not the peasants, but the Bolsheviks, sometimes the anarchists. Their own property engages the landlord's interest solely from the point of view of the welfare of the fatherland. 300 members of the Cadet Party in Chernigov province declare that the peasants, incited by Bolsheviks, are removing the war prisoners from work and themselves independently reaping the harvest. As a result, they cry, "We are threatened with inability to pay the taxes." The very meaning of existence for these liberal landlords lay in supporting the national treasury. The Podolsk branch of the state bank complains of the arbitrary actions of village committees, where presidents are often Austrian prisoners. Here it is injured patriotism that speaks. In Vladimir province, in the manner of a registrar of deeds, Odinstov, the peasants took away building materials that had been made ready for philanthropic institutions. Public officials live only for the love of mankind. A bishop from Podolsk reports the arbitrary seizure of a forest belonging to the house of the archbishop. The procurator complains of the seizure of meadowlands from the Alexandro Nevsky monastery. The Mother Superior of the Kislyarsk convent calls down thunder and lightning upon the members of the local committee. They are interfering in the affairs of the convent, confiscating rentals for their own use, inciting the nuns against their superiors. In all these cases, the spiritual interests of the church are directly affected. Count Tolstoy, one of the sons of Leo Tolstoy, reports in the name of the League of Agriculturalists of Umfimsk province that the transfer of land to the local committees without waiting for a decision of the Constituent Assembly is causing an outburst of dissatisfaction among the peasant proprietors, of whom there are more than 200,000 in the province. The hereditary lord is troubled exclusively about his lesser brothers. Senator Belgart, a proprietor of Tver province, is ready to reconcile himself to cuttings in the forest, but is grieved and offended that the peasants will not submit to the bourgeois government. A Tambov landlord, Vilyanomov, demands the rescue of two estates, which are serving the needs of the army. By accident, these two estates happen to belong to him. For the philosophy of idealism, these landlord telegrams of 1917 are verily a treasure. A materialist will rather see in them a display of the various models of cynicism. He will add, perhaps, that great revolutions deprive the property holders even of the privileged of dignified hypocrisy. So what I'm getting from that is that, Trotsky is saying that the peasants were continually seizing land. When the revolution first began in February, they were first trying to, play a part of the game. They were being a part of the institutions to, see if they can make some reforms to how land was split up amongst people. And now they're started seizing the properties from the bourgeois, from the landed gentry, et cetera, et cetera. And when he's talking about hypocrisy, he's saying that the landed gentry are just astounded. They're appalled that these, vagrants, these muzhiks, these rednecks are basically stealing their land. And that's the great hypocrisy of it all, is that they're living on stolen land. They got their land, because their father was some hero years ago. They don't deserve that land. The people deserve that land. I digress. Continuing here, Trotsky says, the appeals of the victims to the county and provincial authorities, to the Minister of the Interior, to the President of the Council of Ministers, brought as a general rule no result. From whom, then, shall we ask aid? From Rodzianko, President of the State Duma. Between the July days and the Kornilov insurrection, the Lord Chamberlain again felt himself an influential figure. Much was done at a ring from his telephone. The functionaries of the Ministry of the Interior send out circulars to the localities about bringing the guilty to trial. The brusque landlords of Samara telegraph in answer. Circulars without the signature of the socialist minister have no force. The function of socialism is thus revealed. Setzarelli is compelled to overcome his bashfulness. On the 18th of July, he sends out a wordy instruction about taking swift and decisive measures. Like the landlords themselves, Setzarelli worries solely about the army and the state. It seems to the peasants, however, that Setzarelli is protecting the landlords. There came a sudden change in the government's method of pacifying the peasants. Up to July, the prevailing method had been talking them out of it. If military detachments were also sent into the localities, it was only in the capacity of a guard for the government orator. After the victory over the Petrograd workers and soldiers, however, cavalry troops, now without vocal persuaders, put themselves directly at the disposal of the landlords. In Kazan province, one of the most tumultuous, they succeeded. To quote the young historian Yugov, only by means of arrest, by bringing armed troops into the village, and even by reviving the customs of flogging and reducing the peasants to submission. In other places, too, these measures of oppression were not without effect. The number of damaged landlord properties fell somewhere in July, from 516 to 503. In August, the government achieved still further successes. The number of unsatisfactory counties fell from 325 to 288. That is 11%. The number of properties involved in the movement was even reduced 33%. Certain districts, heretofore the most restless, now quiet down or retire to second place. On the other hand, districts which were reliable yesterday now come into the struggle. Only a month ago, the Penza commissar was painting a consoling picture. The country is busy reaping the harvest. Preparations are underway for the elections to the village Zemstvos. The period of governmental crisis passed quietly. The formation of the new government was greeted with great satisfaction. In August, there is not a trace left of this ideal. Mass depredations upon orchards and the cutting down of forest. To quell the disorders, we have had to resort to armed force. In its general character, the summer movement still belongs to the peaceful period. However, unmistakable, although indeed weak, symptoms of radicalization are already to be observed. Whereas in the first 4 months, cases of direct attack upon the landlord's manors decreased. From July on they begin to increase. All right, hold on. Whereas in the first 4 months, cases of direct attack upon the landlord's manor decreased. From July on, they begin to increase. Investigators have established, in general, the following classification of the July conflicts, arranged in a diminishing order, starting with the most numerous: seizure of meadows, of crops, of foodstuffs and fodder, of plowed fields, of implements, conflict over the conditions of employment, destruction of manors. In August, the order is as follows: seizure of crops, of reserve provisions and fodder, of meadows and hay, of land and forest, agrarian terror. At the beginning of September, Kerensky, in his capacity of commander-in-chief, issued a special order, repeating the recent arguments and threats of his predecessor, Kornilov, against violent activities on the parts of the peasants. A few days later, Lenin wrote, "Either all the land to the peasants immediately, or the landlords and capitalists will bring things to the point of an endlessly ferocious peasant revolt." During the months following this became a fact. This is a question, my second question to the audience today, and anybody who answers this question will have their comments read out loud. For Western nations, a lot of us, don't live in societies where, vast amounts of people work in agriculture. If I remember right, it's agriculture is one of the largest industries in America. We even export some food to other parts of the world. But a smaller and smaller percentage of people actually work in agriculture because of the automation and the ability of machines to do the jobs of many people. How much does it matter to propagandize to or rally up the working class who work in the in the farming industry and agriculture, et cetera, et cetera? Has this fundamentally changed? Because a lot of Marxist theory is built upon the collaboration of the peasant class and the working class, the industrial urban working group with the rural people as well. Um, when we think about it, whether you live in New York or Monroe, Louisiana, a lot of us are just working in service industries, right? A lot of us don't build things. We just work in customer service to some degree. I think all jobs have just essentially been relegated to, doing customer service for somebody else who does customer service. Is there still a type of peasantry that exists, within the proletariat? There are different, uh, classes, I guess. We can differentiate amongst different groups of people within the bourgeoisie, such as the petty bourgeoisie, et cetera, et cetera. The, managerial class, if you want to make it that. Of course, in the working class, we have the working poor, you know what I mean? The underemployed, et cetera, et cetera. But does is the peasantry still as important, or should we update revolutionary theory to speak to sort of modern working conditions? This is the question for the audience. This is the question for the audience. Is there a fundamentally different peasantry, or should the peasantry be disregarded in revolutionary theory when we're drawing from the Marxist past? This is the question for the audience. Anybody who answers that question will get their points raised or will have their points addressed. But I digress. Continuing here. So, the number of properties affected by agrarian conflicts in September rose 30% over that in August. In October, 43% over that in September. In September and the first 3 weeks of October, there occurred over a third as many agrarian conflicts as all those recorded since March. Their resoluteness rose, however, incomparably faster than their number. During the first months, even direct seizures of various appurtenances wore the aspect of bargains mitigated and camouflaged by their compromisist institutions. Now the legal mask falls away. Every branch of the movement assumes a more audacious character. From various forms and degrees of pressure, the peasants are now passing over to violent seizures of the various parts of the landlord's business, to the extermination of the nest of the gentility, the burning of manors, even the murder of proprietors and overseers. The struggle for a change in the conditions of rent, which in June exceeded the number of cases, the destructive movement, falls in October to 1/40th the number. Moreover, the rent movement itself changes its character, becoming merely another way of driving out the landlord. The veto on buying and selling land and forest gives place to direct seizure. The mass wood cuttings and mass grazings acquire the character of a deliberate destruction of the landlord's goods. In September, 279 cases of open destruction of property are recorded. They now constitute more than 1/8 of all the conflicts. Over 42% of all the cases of destruction recorded by the militia between the February and October revolutions occurred in the month of October. The struggle for the forest was especially bitter. Whole villages were frequently burned to the ground. The timber was strongly guarded and selling at a high price. The muzhik was starving for timber. Moreover, the time had come to lay up firewood for the winter. Complaints came in from Moscow, Nizhegorod, Petrograd, Orel, and Volyn provinces, from all corners of the country, about the destruction of forests and the seizure of the reserves of corded wood. The peasants are arbitrarily and ruthlessly cutting down the forest. 200 desiatins of the landlord's forest have been burned by the peasants. The peasants of Klimovsky and Chernikovsky counties are destroying the forest and laying waste the winter wheat. The forest guards are in flight. The landlord's forests are groaning. The chips are flying throughout the whole country. All that autumn, the muzhik's axe was feverishly beating time for the revolution. In the districts which imported grain, the food situation in the villages deteriorated at a faster pace than in the city. Not only food was lacking, but seed. In the exporting regions, in consequence of a redoubled pumping out of food resources, the situation was but little better. The raising of the fixed price of grain hit the poor. In a number of provinces, there occurred hunger riots, plundering of granaries, assaults on the institutions of the food administration. The population resorted to substitutes for bread. Reports came in of cases of scurvy and typhus, of suicides from despair. Hunger and its advancing shadow made the neighborhood of opulence and luxury especially intolerable. The more destitute strata of the villages moved into the front ranks of the fight. These waves of bitter feeling raised up no little slime from the bottom. In Kostroma province, a black hundred and anti-Jew agitation is observed. Criminality is on the increase. A waning of interest in the political life of the country is noticeable. This latter phrase in the reports of the commissar means the educated classes are turning their back on the revolution. The voice of Black Hundred monarchism suddenly rings out from the Podolsk province. The committee of the village of Demidovka does not recognize the provisional government and considers the Tsar Nikolai Alexandrovich the most loyal leader of the Russian people. If the provisional government does not retire, we will join the Germans. Such bold acknowledgments, however, are unique. The monarchists among the peasants have long ago changed color, following the example of the landlords. In places, for instance, in that same Podolsk province, military detachments in company with the peasants invade the wine cellars. The commissar reports anarchy. The villages and the people are perishing. The revolution is perishing. No, the revolution is far from perishing. It is digging itself a deeper channel. The raging waters are nearing their mouth. On a night about the 8th of September, the peasants of the village Shaichevka in Tambov province, going from door to door and armed with clubs and pitchforks, called out everybody, small and great, to raid the landlord Romanov. At a village meeting, one group proposed that they take the estate in an orderly fashion, divide the property among the population, and keep the buildings for cultural purposes. Sounds like a plan. Sounds like a plan. The poor demanded that they burn the estate, leaving not one stone upon another. The poor were in the majority. On that same night, an ocean of the fire swallowed up the estates of the whole township. Everything inflammable was burned, even the experimental fields. The breeding cattle were slaughtered. They were drunk to madness. The flames jumped over from township to township. The rustic warriors were now no longer content with the patriarchal scythe and pitchfork. A provincial commissar telegraphed, peasants and unknown persons, armed with revolvers and hand grenades, are raiding the manors in Ronenberg and Ryaski counties. It was the war that introduced this high technique into the peasant revolt. The war always comes home, doesn't it? The local authorities were powerless to restore order. After some delay, troops arrived, sent by the district commander. Martial law was declared, meetings forbidden, the instigators arrested. Ravines were filled with the landlord's possessions, and much of the booty was sunk in the river. A Penza peasant, Begishev, relates, in September, all rode out to raid Logvin. He was raided in 1905 too. A troop of teams and wagons streamed out to his estate and back. Hundreds of muzhiks and wenches began to drive and carry off his cattle, grain, etc. A detachment called out by the land administration tried to get back some of the booty, but the muzhiks and wenches assembled 500 strong in the villages, and the detachment dispersed. The soldiers were evidently not at all eager to restore the trampled rights of the landlord. In Tarai province, beginning with the last days of September, according to the recollections of the peasant Gaponenko, the peasants began to raid the buildings, drive out the overseers, take the work animals, the machinery, the grain from the granaries. They even tore off the blinds from the windows, the doors from their frames, the floors from the rooms, and the zinc roofs, and carried them away. At first, they only came on foot, took what they could, and lugged it off, relates Grunko, a peasant from Minsk. But afterward, they hitched up the horses, whoever had any, and carried things away in whole wagon loads. There was no room to pass. They just dragged and carried things off, beginning at 12 o'clock noon, for 2 days and 2 nights without a stop. In those 48 hours, they cleaned out everything. The seizure of property, according to a Moscow peasant, Kuzmichev, was justified as follows. The landlord was ours. We worked for him, and the property he had ought to belong to us alone. Once upon a time, the landlords used to say to the serfs, "You are mine, and what is yours is mine." Now the peasants were giving their answer. He was our Lord, and all his goods are ours. Very beautiful. I love that right there. That's just beautiful. So basically, all the peasants basically just run up in Mass's house and start taking shit. You know what I mean? Similar to Nat Turner's rebellion. Run up in Massa's house and not only kill Massa, but we actually take Massa's stuff, the wealth that he generated off of our backs. Very, very inspiring here. So, in several localities, they began to knock up the landlords in the night. Pause, no diddy. Pause, no diddy. Anyway, in several localities, they began to knock up the landlords in the night, remembers another Minsk peasant, Novikov. Oftener and oftener, they would burn the landlord's manor. It came the turn of the estates of the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, former commander in chief. When they had taken away all they could get, they began breaking up the stoves, removing the flue plates, ripping up the floors and planks, and dragging it all home. Behind these destructive activities stood the century-old, thousand-year-old strategy of all peasant wars, to raze to the ground the fortified position of the enemy, leave him no place to cover his head. The more reasonable ones, remembers a Kursk peasant, Tizankov, would say, we must not burn up the buildings. They will be of use to us for schools and hospitals. But the majority were the kind that shout out, we must destroy everything so that in case anything happens, our enemy will have no place to hide. The peasants seized all the landlord's property, relates an Oral peasant, Savchenko, drove the landlords out of the estates, smashed the windows, doors, ceilings, and floors of the landlord's houses. The soldiers said, if you destroy the wolf's nest, you must strangle the wolves too. Through such threats, the biggest and most important landlords hid out, and for that reason, there was no murder of landlords. In the village of Zalesny, in Vitebsk province, they burned barns full of grain and hay in the estates belonging to a Frenchman, Barnard. The muzhiks were the less inclined to investigate questions of nationality, since many of the landlords had transferred their land in a hurry to privileged foreigners. The French embassy requests that measures be taken. In the front region, in the middle of October, it was difficult to take measures even in behalf of the French embassy. Here is my third question for the day. And once again, anybody who answers one of the questions or comments on the text will have their comments read out loud. My question is, how do we feel about destroying the property or destroying the workplaces where we are now modern day serfs? I believe recently there was a guy who blew up an Amazon warehouse that he was working at as an act of working class terrorism against the bourgeoisie. And what we are witnessing in Trotsky's writing right here is that the peasants are essentially blowing up the barns, blowing up the granaries, blowing up the fields, even killing their own work animals as a revolt against the exploitation that the landlord class has over them. How do we feel about that? In my opinion, I believe to some degree, this tactic could be useful. I believe this tactic could be useful. Of course, it has to be paired with a mass workers' movement. It has to not be adventurism. But I do believe, getting rid or knocking off a few Amazon warehouses, a few plants and factories where workers are exploited could be a revolutionary act. But I would like to know what you think. What you think, okay? That's the third question of the day. Continuing here. The destruction of the great estates near Ryazan continued 4 days. Even children took part in the looting. The League of Landed Proprietors brought to the attention of the ministers that if measures were not taken, lynch law, famine, and civil war would break out. It is difficult to understand why the landlords were still speaking of civil war in the future tense. Because the war is right now. We are living through class war. We're living through race war. And even Trotsky is saying, like, why are they talking about civil war in the future? It's going on right now, buddy. The war's been on. Anyway, it's difficult to understand why the landlords were still speaking of civil war in the future tense. At a Congress of the Cooperatives at the beginning of September, Birkenheim, one of the leaders of the strong trading peasantry, said, I am convinced that not yet all Russia has become a madhouse. That as yet, for the most part, only the population of the big cities has gone mad. This self-complacent voice of the solid and conservative part of the peasantry was hopelessly behind the times. It was during that very month that the villages totally broke loose from all nooses of reason, and the ferocity of their struggle left the madhouse of the cities far behind. In April, Lenin had still considered it possible that the patriotic cooperators and the kulaks would drag the main mass of the peasantry after them along the road of compromise with the bourgeoisie and the landlord. For this reason, he so tirelessly insisted upon the creation of special Soviets of farmhands deputies and upon independent organizations of the poorest peasantry. Month by month, it became clear, however, that this part of the Bolshevik policy would not take root. Except in the Baltic state, there were no Soviets of farmhands. The peasant poor also failed to find independent forms of organization. To explain this merely by the backwardness of the farmhands and the poorest strata of the villages would be to miss the essence of the thing. The chief cause lay in the substance of the historic task itself, a democratic agrarian revolution. Upon the two principal questions, rent and hired labor, it becomes convincingly clear how the general interest of a struggle against the relics of serfdom cut off the road to an independent policy, not only for the poor peasants, but for the hired hands. The peasants rented from the landlords in European Russia 27 million desiatines, or about 60% of all the privately owned land. And they paid a yearly rental tribute of 400 million rubles. The struggle against peonage conditions of rent became, after the February Revolution, the chief element of the peasant movement. A smaller but still very important place was occupied by the struggle of the rural wage workers, which brought them in opposition not only to the landlord, but also to the peasant exploiters. The tenant was struggling for an alleviation of the conditions of rent, the worker for an improvement in the conditions of labor. Both of them, each in his own way, started out by recognizing the landlord as property holder and boss. But as soon as the possibility opened of carrying the thing through to the end, that is, of taking the land and occupying it themselves, the poor peasants ceased to be interested in questions of rent, and the trade union began to lose its attraction for the hired hand. It was these rural workers and poor tenants who, by joining the general movement, gave its ultimate determination to the peasant war and made it irrevocable. Very interesting right here. So, Trotsky is saying, like, most of the people who were living in Russia at the time, they were renting the land, or at least when he's talking about the peasants. And I do believe that we have a rent crisis in America and the West in general. There are many people who can't afford their rent. Many people are becoming renters and don't find it possible to own their own home. Is this also an avenue for agitating revolutionary struggle? When the contradictions of the rental market continually becoming, exorbitantly expensive for people to actually live in, when they have to commute far and further away from the places of actual industry, can this agitation, can this contradiction, lead to revolutionary struggle? That's a question here. And I believe so. I guess that's the fourth question for the day. What do you think? Is rent, our rent, exorbitantly high rent prices in our modern day sufficient enough to agitate for revolutionary struggle the same way Trotsky is bringing up, the vast amount of renters in Russia agitated the struggle there? But I will continue. But the campaign against the landlord did not draw in quite so completely the opposite pole of the village, so long as it did not come to open revolt. The upper circles of the peasantry played a prominent role in the movement, at times a leading role. In the autumn period, however, the well-to-do muzhiks looked with continually increasing distrust at the spread of the peasant war. They did not know how this would end. They had something to lose. They stood aside, but they did not succeed in holding off entirely. The village would not permit it. More reserved and hostile than our own communal kulaks were the small landowners standing outside the commune. In the whole country, there were 600,000 homesteads of peasants owning plots up to 50 desiatines. In many localities, they constituted the backbone of the cooperatives and gravitated, especially in the South, toward the conservative peasant union, which had already become a bridge toward cadet party. The secessionists and rich peasants, according to Gulis, a Minsk peasant, supported the landlords and tried to appease the peasantry with arguments. In some places, under the influence of local conditions, the struggle within the peasantry assumed a furious character, even before the October Revolution. The secessionists suffered most cruelly in this struggle. Almost all their farm buildings were burnt, says Kuzmichev, a Nizhgorod peasant. Their property was partly annihilated and partly seized by the peasants. The secessionist was the landlord's servant and trusted with several of the landlord's forest tracts. He was favorite of the police, the gendarmerie, and the rulers. The richest peasants and merchants of several villages of Nizhegorod County disappeared in the autumn and returned to their neighborhoods only after 2 or 3 years. Very interesting. He's saying that the secessionists, were the protectors of the property interest of the landlords, of the landed gentry. Is this not very similar to what we saw in America, where secessionists, in the name of keeping black people as slaves, were willing to fight and die for the rights of a small minority of people who owned vast amounts of property and also people? I think this is something for us to think about and reflect upon, but I digress. I will continue here. But in most sections of the country, the inner relations among the peasantry were far from reaching such bitterness. The kulaks conducted themselves diplomatically, put on the brakes, and restricted, but tried not to set themselves too sharply against the mir, or the people. The rank and file villager, on his part, jealously watched the kulaks and would not let them unite with the landlords. The struggle between the nobles and the peasantry for influence upon the kulak continued throughout the whole year 1917 in various different forms, from friendly pressure to ferocious terrorism. While the lords of the latifundia were ingratiatingly throwing open to the peasant proprietors the main entrances to the assemblies of the nobility, the small landowners were demonstratively drawing apart from the nobility in order not to perish with them. In politics, this found expression in the fact that the landlords who had belonged before the revolution to the extreme right party redecorated themselves now in the tints of liberalism, adopting them from memory as a protective coloration, whereas the peasant proprietors who had often supported the cadets in the past now shifted to the left. Very, very interesting. Gonna read here. Mm. Hmm. Mm. Sorry, I had to take a quick water break. Mm. A Congress of Petty Proprietors of Perm Province, held in September, emphatically distinguished itself from the Moscow Congress of Landed Proprietors, at the head of whom stood counts, dukes, and barons. An owner of 50 dessiatines said, "The cadets never wore armyak and lapti, and therefore will never defend our interest." Pushing away from the liberals, the laboring proprietor would look around for such socialists as would stand for property rights. One of the delegates came out for the social democracy. The worker, he said, give him land and he will come to the village and stop spitting blood. The social democrats will not take the land away from us. He was speaking, of course, of the Mensheviks. We will not give away our land to anybody. Those will easily part with it who easily got it, as for example, the landlord. But the peasant had a hard time getting the land. In that autumn period, the villages were struggling with the kulaks, not throwing them off, but compelling them to adhere to the general movement and defend it against blows from the right. There were even cases where a refusal to participate in a raid was punished by the death of the culprits. The kulak maneuvered while he could, but at the last moment, scratching the back of his head once more, hitched the well fed horses to the iron rimmed wagon and went out for his share. It was often the lion's share. The well to do got the most out of it, says the Penza peasant, Beghishev, those who had horses and free men. Savchenko from Orel expressed himself in almost the same words. The kulaks mostly got the best of it, being well fed and with something to draw the wood in. According to the calculations of Veramenechev, to 4,954 agrarian conflicts with landlords between February and October There were 324 conflicts with the peasant bourgeoisie, an extraordinarily clear correlation. It alone firmly establishes the fact that the peasant movement of 1917 was directed in its social foundations not against capitalism, but against the relics of serfdom. The struggle against kulakism developed only later, in 1918, after the conclusive liquidation of the landlord. Very interesting. So what Trotsky is saying here is that the February revolution was primarily what we saw in chapter 7, my favorite chapter still to this day, was the workers and the soldiers and some of the peasants who had come to the city fighting against the capitalist and the bourgeois interest. But meanwhile, in the rural parts of Russia, they're still fighting against serfdom. They're still fighting against the foundations that laid the groundwork for capitalism to be so profound and exploitative. And so, very interesting. Trotsky is saying here that there's a difference between the kulaks, who are the small landowners, and the great landowners, who own dessiatines and many dessiatines of land. You know what I mean? And so, the fight against kulakism is a fight against the basically petty bourgeoisie of the peasantry, and the fight against the landlords is against serfdom in its truest form. You get what I'm saying? So, continuing here. This purely democratic character of the peasant movement, which should, it would seem, have given the official democracy an unconquerable power, did in fact completely reveal its rottenness. If you look at the thing from above, the peasants were wholly led by the social revolutionaries, elected them, followed them, almost blended with them. At the May Congress of Peasant Soviets, in the elections to the Executive Committee, Chernov received 810 votes, Kerensky 804, whereas Lenin got only 20 votes all in all. It was not for nothing that Chernov dubbed himself rural minister. But it was not for nothing either that the strategy of the villages brusquely parted company with Chernov's strategy. Their industrial isolation makes the peasants so determined in struggle with a concrete landlord impotent before the general landlord incarnate in the state. Hence, the organic need of the muzhiks to rely upon some legendary state as against the real one. In olden times, they created pretenders. They united round an imagined golden edict of the Tsar, or around the legend of a righteous world. After the February Revolution, they united round the social revolutionary banner, land and freedom, seeking help in it against the liberal landlord who had become a governmental commissar. The Narodnik program bore the same relation to the real government of Kerensky as the imagined edict of the Tsar to the real autocrat. So once again, some Trotsky is making the argument here that people that were believing in this Kerensky government were no different than people that believed in the imagined world of monarchism. That this land is holy, it's protected by the divine right of the king to dish out to the people and protect the people as he sees fit. And so, the realism and the materialism of the February Revolution and the coming Bolshevik Revolution in October have yet to really hit the people. And so, very, very interesting that Trotsky is contrasting, idealist forms of government with materialist forms of analysis. Very, very interesting right here. Continuing. In the program of the social revolutionaries, there was always much that was utopian. They hoped to create socialism on the basis of a petty trade economy, but the foundation of their program was democratically revolutionary, to take the land from the landlord. When confronted with the necessity of carrying out its program, the party got tangled up in a coalition. Not only the landlords rose against the confiscation of the land, but also the cadet bankers. The banks had loaned against real estate no less than 4 billion rubles, intending to dicker with the landlords at the Constituent Assembly regarding prices, but end things in a friendly manner. The social revolutionaries zealously kept the muzhik away from the land. They went to pieces, therefore, not on the utopian character of their socialism, but on their their democratic inconsistency. It might have taken years to test out their utopianism. Their betrayal of agrarian democracy became clear in a few months. Under a government of social revolutionaries, the peasants had to take the road of insurrection in order to carry out the social revolutionary program. In July, when the government was coming down on the villages with measures of repression, the peasants, in hot haste, ran for defense to those same social revolutionaries. From Pontius the Young, they appealed for protection to Pilate the Old. From Pontius the Young, they appealed for protection from Pilate the Old. The month of the greatest weakening of the Bolsheviks in the cities was the month of the greatest expansion of the social revolutionaries in the country. As usually happens, especially in a revolutionary epoch, the maximum of organizational scope coincided with the beginning of a political decline. Hiding behind social revolutionaries from the blows of a social revolutionary government, the peasants steadily lost confidence both in the government and the party. Thus, the swelling out of the social revolutionary organizations in the villages became fatal to this universal party, which was rebelling at the bottom but restoring order at the top. In Moscow, at a meeting of the military organization on the 30th of July, a delegate from the front, himself a social revolutionary, said, although the peasants still think themselves social revolutionaries, a rift has formed between them and the party. The soldiers confirmed this. Under the influence of social revolutionary agitation, the peasants are still hostile to the Bolsheviks, but in practice, they decide the questions of land and power in a Bolshevik manner. The Bolshevik Pavlovsky, who worked in the Volga region, testifies that the most respected social revolutionaries, those who had taken part in the movement of 1905, were more and more feeling themselves pushed aside. The muzhiks called them old men, treating them with external difference, but voting in their own way. It was the workers and soldiers who had taught the villages to vote and take action in their own way. It is impossible to weigh the influence of the revolutionary workers upon the peasantry. It was continuous, molecular, penetrating everywhere, and therefore not capable of calculation. A mutual penetration was made easier by the fact that a considerable number of the industrial plants were situated in rural districts. But even the workers of Petrograd, the most utopian, sorry, but even the workers of Petrograd, the most European of cities, kept up a close connection with their native villages. Unemployment increasing during the summer months and the lockouts of the employers threw back many thousands of workers into the villages. A majority of them became agitators and leaders. From May to June, there were created in Petrograd back home clubs corresponding to different provinces, counties, and even villages. Whole columns in the workers' press were devoted to announcements of back home club meetings where reports about journeys to the villages would be heard, instructions drawn up for delegates, and money collected for agitation. Not long before the uprising, these clubs united around a special central bureau under the leadership of the Bolsheviks. This back home club movement soon spread to Moscow, Tver, and probably to a number of other industrial cities. Very interesting what Trotsky is saying here. He's saying that, essentially the workers in the cities are coming back to these small villages and agitating and radicalizing people, which I think is very, very inspiring and something that we should also keep in mind. I know a lot of us come from, small, shitty towns or rural communities or backward places in the West. You know what I mean? And we've all, wanted to strive for something better. You know what I mean? And a lot of us abandoned small town America, maybe small town America or small town Western, countries. Are the places where we can get the most revolutionary fervor stirred up. You know what I mean? What do we actually think? This is a question for the audience. Alex has joined the live stream. What do you think? Do you think we can have revolutionary potential in small town America or other small town cities in Western developed nations? Okay. What do you think, Alex, who has joined the live stream? Continuing here. However, in the matter of direct influence upon the village, the soldiers were still more important. It was only in the artificial conditions of the front or in the city barrack that the young peasants, overcoming to a certain degree their isolation, will come face to face with problems of nationwide scope. Here too, however, their political dependence made itself felt, while continually failing under the leadership of patriotic and conservative intellectuals and then striving to get free of them. The peasants tried to organize in the army separately from other social groups. The authorities looked unfavorably upon these inclinations. The War Ministry opposed them. The social revolutionaries did not welcome them. The Soviets of peasants' deputies took but weak root in the army. Even under the most favorable conditions, the peasant is unable to convert his overwhelming quantity into a political quality. Only in the big revolutionary centers, under the direct influence of the workers, did the Soviets of peasant soldiers succeed in developing any important work. Thus, between April 1917 and January 1st, 1918, the Peasant Soviet in Petrograd sent 1,395 agitators into the villages with special mandate and about the same number without mandates. These delegates covered 65 provinces. Entranced back home clubs were formed among the sailors and soldiers, following the example of the workers, and they supplied their delegates with credentials giving them the right to free passage on railroads and steamboats. The private lines accepted these papers without a murmur. Conflicts arose on the government lines. Okay? So, yeah, let's go here. We got to put Alex out of here. All right, we have to put some other people out of here as well. Okay, once again, if I ask you a question, if I directly look you in the eye and ask you a question, you better answer it. You better answer it, because if I'm taking my time to directly ask you a question, you better answer. Okay? If not, you will be quickly escorted out of here, because this is a book club. This is a library. This is a place of education and intellectual discussion, not a place to talk about BS. So, very interesting what Trotsky is saying here. Very interesting what Trotsky is saying here. He's saying that, the workers were coming and agitating for people, and raising the revolutionary and class consciousness of the peasants. But the soldiers, once again, the soldiers are the heroes of Trotsky's book, because the soldiers have been radicalized. The soldiers are doing a lot of revolutionary work throughout the country, and it is very inspiring and very enlightening for me reading this. This book switched my mind from thinking that all cops are bastards to all cops are inherently communist. We went from ACAB to ACAC. Pause. All cops are communist. They just don't know it yet. All cops are communist. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. But what do you think? For example, I'm going to once again lay down my log here. If I ask you directly a question, you better answer. Isaac Sosa, what do you think about propagandizing to police and soldiers? Do you think this is a proper strategy we should use as leftists, as socialists, as communists to raise class consciousness? Or should we continue to just agitate blindly against forces of state power, such as the police and the army? What do you think, Isaac Sosa? And if Isaac Sosa does not answer the question, he will be quickly escorted out of here. Continuing here. These official delegates of organizations were, after all, however, mere drops in the peasant ocean. And infinitely greater work was accomplished by those hundreds of thousands of millions of soldiers who quit the front and the rear garrisons of their own accord, with the strong slogans of mass meeting speeches ringing in their ears. Those who had sat silent at the front became garrulous at home in the villages. They found no lack of greedy listeners. Among the peasantry surrounding Moscow, says Morozov, one of the Moscow Bolsheviks, there was a tremendous swing to the left. The villages and towns of Moscow provinces, or Moscow province, were swarming with deserters from the front. They were visited also by city proletarians who had not yet cut off their connections with the country. The dreamy and backward villages of Kaluga province, according to the peasant Namachenkov, were waked up by soldiers coming home from the front for various reasons during June and July. The Nizhegorod Commissar reports that all the law breaking and lawlessness is connected with the appearance within the boundaries of the province of deserters, soldiers on furlough, or delegates from the regimental committees. The overseer of the properties of Princess Beryatinsky of Zolotonesky County complains in August of the arbitrary acts of the land committee, whose president is a Kronstadt sailor, Gatrin. Soldiers and sailors on furlough, reports the commissar of Bugomisk County, are carrying on an agitation with a view to creating anarchy and a pogrom state of mind. In Miglinsk County, in the village of Bielgorsk, an arriving sailor on his own authority forbade the preparation and export of firewood and railroad ties from the forest. And when it was not the soldiers who began the struggle, it was they who finished it. In Nizhegorod County, the muzhiks harried a convent, cut the meadow grass, broke down the fences, and bothered the nuns. The Mother Superior refused to get in, and the militia would carry off the muzhiks and punish them. So the thing dragged along, writes the peasant Arbakov, until the soldiers arrived. The buddies immediately took the bull by the horns. The convent was cleaned out. In Mogilev province, according to the peasant Bobkov, the soldiers home from the front were the first leaders in the committee and directed the expulsion of the landlords. Very interesting what Trotsky is saying here. He's saying that, you know, the soldiers were doing a lot of agitation and raising the class consciousness. You know, soldiers who were very quiet on the front, witnessing their friends die and witnessing the exploitation and needlessness of this war, basically came back to the villages and were telling people that this is senseless. We need to change society. And also, the soldiers were helping, you know, expropriate the land of the landlords, which is good. But if I understand this story right, Trotsky is saying here that the soldiers, you know, started, you know, expropriating the land from the churches and the nuns and the convents and shit like that. And Trotsky earlier made this argument that, you know, the church was in bed with the bourgeoisie. They were going to support the bourgeoisie in maintaining their exploitative land deals with the peasants because they wanted to protect their property, which were the churches and convents and stuff like that. And so, if I understand right, they expropriated the land. From these nuns, et cetera, et cetera. All right. Let's put some more people here. All right. All right. So once again, this is all right. So Isaac Sosa answered the question, thankfully. He said, absolutely do that, as in we should propagandize to police and soldiers. And he said, control the cops and you control society. Absolutely, very, very important as well. Okay? Very, very true. Once again, everybody, please click the description. Ask a stupid question like that and you will quickly be escorted out. We have no tolerance for fools around here. If you click the description, you will see very quickly what book we are reading. Okay? Continuing here. The men from the front introduced into the business the heavy determination of people accustomed to handle their fellow men with rifle and bayonet. Even the soldiers' wives caught this fighting mood from their husbands. Says the Penza peasant, Begishev, in September there was a strong movement of soldiers' wives who spoke at meetings in favor of the raids. The same thing was observed in other provinces. In the cities, too, the soldiers' wives were often the leaven in the lump. Those cases in which soldiers took the lead in peasant disorders constituted a march according to Veremenchev's calculations. 1%. In April, 8%. In September, 12%. And in October, 17%. These figures cannot pretend to be accurate, but they show the general tendency unmistakably. The dying leadership of the social revolutionary teachers, towns clerks, and functionaries was giving place to the leadership of soldiers who would stop at nothing. Parvus, a German Marxist writer prominent in his day, who succeeded in acquiring wealth and losing both his principles and his penetration during the war, has compared the Russian soldiers with the mercenary troopers, robbers, and hold-up men of medieval times. For this, it is necessary to shut one's eyes to the fact that in all their lawlessness, the Russian soldiers remain merely the executive organ of the greatest agrarian revolution in history. So yeah, Trotsky's ardently defending these soldiers who came back home and helped with the looting, helped with the expropriation of land, did not call them villains like some Marxists of his day, like Parvus did. He is saying that this is a righteous thing to do. To seize the land from the expropriating class is a righteous, right thing to do. And I find it hard to disagree. I find that hard to disagree with. Continuing here, so long as the movement had not broken completely with legality, the sending of troops into the villages preserved a symbolic character. In practice, it was almost the Cossacks alone who could be used as punitive troops 400 Cossacks were sent into Serdobsky County. This measure had a tranquilizing effect. The peasants declared that they would await the Constituent Assembly, says the liberal paper Rusko Selo on the 11th of October. 400 Cossacks is certainly an argument in favor of the Constituent Assembly. But there were not enough Cossacks, and moreover, they too were uncertain. Meantime, the government was oftener and oftener being compelled to take decisive measures. During the first 4 months of the revolution, Vereminchev's counts 17 cases in which armed forces were sent against the peasants. In July and August, 39 cases. In September and October, 105 cases. To put down the peasantry by armed force was only to pour oil on the fire. In a majority of cases, the soldiers went over to the peasants. A county commissar of Podolsk province reports the army organizations and even individual units are deciding social and economic questions, are forcing the peasants to carry out seizures and cut the forest. And at times, in certain localities, they themselves take part in the looting. The local military units refuse to join in putting down acts of violence. Thus, the rural revolt loosened the last bolts of the army. There was not the slightest possibility that in these circumstances of a peasant war headed by the workers, the army would permit itself to be thrown against the insurrection in the cities. From the workers and soldiers, the peasants first learned something new, something older than what the social revolutionaries had told them about the Bolsheviks. The slogans of Lenin and his name penetrated the village. The steadily increasing complaints against Bolsheviks were, however, in many cases, invented or exaggerated. The landlords hoped in this way to make more sure of getting help. In Ostrovsky County, complete anarchy reigns, a consequence of Bolshevik propaganda. From Ufa province comes the news. A member of a village committee, Vasilyev, is distributing the program of the Bolsheviks and openly declaring that the landlords are to be hanged. In seeking protection from robbery, the Novgorod landlord, Polonik, does not forget to add, the executive committees are brimful of Bolsheviks. That means that they are unfavorable to the landlord. In August, remembers a Simbirsk peasant, Zimorov, workers began to make the rounds of the villages, agitating for the Bolshevik Party and telling about its program. An investigator of Sebedsk County tells about the arrival from Petrograd of a weaver, Tatiana Mikhailova, 26 years old, who called the people of her village to overthrow the provisional government and praise the tactics of Lenin. In Smolensk province, toward the end of August, according to the peasant Kotov, we begin to interest ourselves in Lenin, begin to listen to the voice of Lenin. In the village Zemstovo, however, they were still electing an immense majority of social revolutionaries. So once again, very similar to our timeline here. You know, we have very, very poor people who live in rural parts of America, very people who could very much use the expropriation of land and seizing of the means of production, bringing the wealth back to the people, and yet and still they vote for Republicans. They vote for people that say that more and more wealth should matriculate into the hands of a smaller and smaller minority. They vote for more and more rights for the private owning class to be able to exploit the working class. Very similar to what Trotsky is saying here, the Bolsheviks' rhetoric is proving to be right. The methods and goals of the Bolsheviks are proving to be right and attractive to the people of Russia at this time. And what do? They turn around and vote for the social revolutionaries, not the Bolsheviks, but the people who are socialists in name only, who seek to only protect the rights of the property owners. Okay? So something else that we need to overcome. What do you think about that? Why do you think that is? Why do you think people in rural parts of America or other parts of the world tend to vote against their economic self-interest? Usually there is a left-leaning party who wants to try to lift the living conditions and working conditions of the rural poor and working class, at least in theory and name, and yet and still people vote for people that want to continue to elevate the rights of a small owning capitalist clique. Do you think that's only false class consciousness that causes that? Or do you think there is some greater reason for that to happen? But I digress. Let's continue here. The Bolshevik Party was trying to get closer to the peasant. On the 10th of September, Nevsky demanded that the Petrograd Committee undertake the publication of a peasant newspaper. We must fix things so that we shall not have the experience of the French Commune, where the peasantry did not understand Paris and did not understand the peasantry. The newspaper Biednota soon came out. But even so, the purely party work among the peasants remained insignificant. The strength of the Bolshevik Party lay not in technical resources, not in machinery, but in a correct policy. As air currents carry seeds, the whirlwinds of the revolution scattered the ideas of Lenin. Okay? Very, very interesting. By September, remembers a Tiver peasant, Vorobiev, not only the soldiers, but the poor peasants themselves were oftener and more boldly beginning to come out at meetings in defense of the Bolsheviks. This is confirmed by the Simbirsk peasant Zumarin. Among the poor and some of the middle peasants, the name Lenin was on everybody's lips. The talk was only of Lenin. A Novgorod peasant, Grigoriev, tells how a social revolutionary in the village called the Bolsheviks usurpers and traitors, and how the muzhiks thundered, "Down with the dog, pound him with rock. Don't tell us any more fairy stories. Where is the land? That's enough from you. Give us the Bolsheviks." It is possible, by the way, that this episode, and there were many like it, derives from the post-October period. Facts stand strong in a peasant's memory, but its chronology is weak. The soldier Chinoviv, who came back to his home in Oral province with a trunk full of Bolshevik literature, had not been welcomed by the home village. It's probably German gold, they said. But in October, the village nucleus had 700 members and many rifles, and always comes out in defense of the Soviet paper. The Bolshevik Verachev tells how the peasants of the purely agricultural province of Voronezh woke up from the effects of the social revolutionary fumes and began to take an interest in our party. Thanks to which we already had a number of village and township locals and subscribers to our papers, and received many good fellows in the tiny headquarters of our committee. In Smolensk province, according to the recollection of Ivanov, the Bolsheviks were very rare in the villages. There were very few of them in the counties. There were no Bolshevik papers. Leaflets were very rarely given out. And nevertheless, the nearer it came to October, the more the villages swung over to the Bolsheviks. So, to some degree, what Trotsky is saying here is that the social revolutionaries were sort of like the gateway drug for more radical leftist politics, which is why I think, it's important for people to get involved in their community, get involved in some party that aligns with your goals. Because as we continue to see the contradictions of this society continue to reach a boiling point, as we continue to see this decadent society continue to wage imperial wars, and the living and working conditions of average people continue to deteriorate, as AI looms around the corner to take all of our jobs, I do think many people will realize that just being a Democrat is not enough. Just being a democratic socialist is not enough. Just being a socialist is not enough. Being a full-on Marxist communist is the only way. Once again, I've said this before in previous live streams. There is no way out of our fucked up situation other than full-blown communism, other than striving to attain socialism. That is our only way out of this. And what Trotsky is saying here is that many people in the villages were realizing that, the social revolutionaries are promising a utopian vision. The social revolutionaries actually just have a vision of a future that can only be attained through idealistic means. But the Bolsheviks are the only one tied into reality and the material forces that can actually dictate how we interact with each other and are alienated from ourselves and seek to change that. So I do think, this is very important. But what do you think? What do you think? Are, the Democratic Socialists? Is the PSL? Is the CPUSA? Is any leftist organization or any leftist movement right now sufficient enough to move people? Should people just start getting involved with the Democrats just for the sake of, well, it's better than them not getting involved at all? And similar to how, MAGA is the result of years of indoctrination and rightward tendencies of the right reaching their fullest conclusion, their most distilled form, or maybe not even their most distilled form. Their most distilled form is Nazism, which I do think is around the corner in America. Similar to that, You know, your uncle who has 3 teeth and, you know, lives in West Virginia, he became MAGA after hearing many, many years of right-wing propaganda saying America should be run like a business. You know, our country is a Christian nation. All this other bullshit. It took years and years of years to get basically stupid white people in America to become MAGA, right? Is it not going to take sort of like the same thing to essentially just make your average, you know, Midwest mom and dad communist? Will it take the same thing? Will it take the same thing? I think so. I think so. I think so. But what do you think? What do you think? This is my 5th question to the audience today. Anybody who answers that question will have their comment read out loud, or any commentary on the text will be read out loud. But I digress. In those counties where there was a Bolshevik influence in the Soviet before October, writes Ivanov again, the elements of raids upon landlords' estates either did not appear or appeared only to a small extent. In this respect, however, it was not the same everywhere. The Bolshevik demand for the transfer of land to the peasants, says, for example, Tadush, was taken up with extraordinary rapidity by the mass of the peasants of the Mogilev County, who laid waste the estates, in some cases burning them, and seized the harvest in the forest. In essence, there is no contradiction between the two testimonies. The general agitation of the Bolsheviks undoubtedly nourished the civil war in the country. But wherever the Bolsheviks had succeeded in putting down firm roots, they naturally tried, without weakening the assault of the peasants, to regulate its forms and decrease the amount of destruction. The land question did not stand alone. The peasant suffered especially during the last period of the war, both as seller and buyer. Grain was taken from him at a fixed price, and the products of industry were becoming more and more unattainable. The problem of economic correlation between the country and the city, destined subsequently under the name of the scissors to become the central problem of Soviet economy, was already showing its threatening face. The Bolsheviks were saying to the peasants, the Soviets must seize the power, give you the land, end the war, demobilize industry, establish workers' control of production, and regulate the price relations between industrial and agricultural products. However, summary, this answer may have been, it did indicate the road. The partition wall between us and the peasantry, said Trotsky on the 10th of October at a conference of factory committees, is the little counselors of Avkenstiev. We must break through this wall. We must explain to the village that all the attempts of the workers to help the peasants by supplying the village with agricultural implements will give no result until workers' control of organized production is established. The conference issued a manifesto to the peasants in this sense. Okay? Let's get this guy out of here, okay? All right, so once again, the Petrograd workers created at the factories in those days special commissions which would assemble metals, damaged parts, and fragments for the use of a special center called worker to peasant. This scrap iron was used for making the simplest agricultural implements and reserve parts. The first planned entry of the workers into the process of production, still tiny in scope and with agitational aims, prevailing over economics, nevertheless opened out prospects for the near future. Frightened at this entrance of the Bolsheviks into the forbidden sphere of the village, the Peasant Executive Committee made an attempt to get hold of the new enterprise. But the decrepit compromisers were no longer in any condition to compete with the Bolsheviks on the city arena when the ground was already slipping under their feet in the villages. The echoes of the Bolshevik agitation so aroused the peasant poor, writes Vorobiev, the Tver peasant, that we may definitely say, if October had not come in October, it would have come in November. This colorful description of the political strength of Bolshevism does not contradict the fact of its organizational weakness. Only through such striking disproportions does a revolution make its way. It is for this very reason, to tell the truth, that its movement cannot be forced into the framework of formal democracy. To accomplish the agrarian revolution, whether in October or November, the peasantry had no other course but to make use of the unraveling web of that same social revolutionary party. Its left elements were hastily and unsystematically forming a group under the pressure of the peasant revolt, following the Bolsheviks and competing with them. During the coming months, the political shift of the peasantry will take place chiefly under the glossy banner of the left social revolutionaries. This ephemeral party will become a reflected and unstable form of rural Bolshevism, a temporary bridge from the peasant war to the proletarian revolution. The agrarian revolution had to have its own local institutions. How did they look? There existed several types of organizations in the village. State institutions, such as the executive committee of the township, the land and food committees, social institutions like the Soviets, purely political institutions like the parties, and finally organs of self-government exemplified in the town zemstvos. The peasant Soviets had as yet developed only on a province, or to some extent a county scale. There were few town Soviets. The town zemstvos had been slow to take root. The land and executive committees, on the other hand, although state organs in design, became, strange as it may seem at a first glance, the organs of the peasant revolution. The head land committees, consisting of governmental functionaries, landlords, professors, scientific agriculturalists, social revolutionary politicians, and an admixture of dubious peasants, became in essence the main break of the agrarian revolution. The province committees never ceased to be the conducting wires of the governmental policy. The county committees oscillated between the peasants and the men higher up. The town committees, however, elected by the peasants and working right there before the eyes of the village, became the instruments of the agrarian movement. The circumstances that the members of these committees usually registered as social revolutionaries made no difference. They kept step with the peasant's hut and not the lord's manor. The peasants especially treasured the state character of their land committees, seeing in this a sort of patent right to civil war. The peasants say that they recognize nothing but the town committee, complains one of the chiefs of militia in Saronsky County as early as May. All the county and city committees, they say, work for the landlords. According to a Nizhegorod commissar, the attempts of certain town committees to oppose the independent action of the peasants almost always ends in failure and brings about a change of membership of the committee. According to Denisov, a peasant from Pskov, the committees were always on the side of the peasants' movement against the landlord because the most revolutionary part of the peasantry and soldiers from the front were elected to them. The county, and more especially the province committees, were led by the functionary intelligentsia, which was trying to keep up peaceful relations with the landlord. The peasants saw, writes the Moscow peasant Yurkov, that this was the same coat, only inside out, the same power, but with another name. An effort is underway, reports the Kursk commissar, to get new elections to the county committees, which are invariably carrying out the directions of the provisional government. It was very hard, however, for the peasants to get into the county committees. The social revolutionaries kept hold of the political ties between the villages and townships, and the peasants were thus compelled to act through a party whose chief mission consisted of turning the old coat inside out. The coolness of the peasantry toward the March Soviets, astonishing at first glance, had, as a matter of fact, very deep causes. The Soviet was not a special organization like the Land Committee, but a universal organ of the revolution. Now, in the sphere of general politics, the peasant cannot take a step without leadership. The only question is where it is to come from. The provincial and county peasant Soviets were created on the initiative and to a considerable extent at the expense of the cooperatives, not as organs of a peasant revolution, but as organs of a conservative guardianship over the peasants. The villagers tolerated these right social revolutionary Soviets, standing above them as a shield against the authorities. But at home, among themselves, they preferred the land committees. In order to prevent the village from shutting itself up in a circle of purely peasant interest, the government made haste to create democratic zemstvos. That alone was enough to put the muzhik on his guard. It was frequently necessary to enforce the elections. There were cases of lawlessness, reports the Penza commissar, resulting in a breakup of the elections. In Minsk province, the peasants arrested the president of the electoral commission of the town, Prince Drutskoy Libertskoy, accusing him of tampering with the list. It was not easy for the muzhiks to come to an agreement with him about the democratic solution of their age-old quarrel. The county commissar of Bugelminsk reported the elections to the town Zemstvos throughout the county, have not gone quite according to plan. The members of the electorate are exclusively peasants. There is a noticeable estrangement from the local intelligentsia, especially from the landowners. In this form, the Zemstvo was but little different from the committee. The attitude of the peasant masses toward the intelligentsia, and especially the landowners, complains the Minsk county commissar, is adverse. We read in a Mogilev newspaper of September 23rd, cultural work in the country is accompanied with a certain risk, unless one categorically promises to cooperate toward the immediate transfer of all the land to the peasants. Where agreement and even intercourse between the fundamental classes of the population becomes impossible, the ground for democratic institutions disappears. The stillbirth of the town Zemstvos unmistakably foretold the collapse of the Constituent Assembly. Okay? So the local peasantry, reports the Nizhegorod commissar, have got a fixed opinion that all civil laws have lost their force, and that all legal relations ought now to be regulated by peasant organizations. Getting control of the militia in certain localities, the town committees would issue local laws, establish rents, regulate wages, put their own overseers on estates, take over the land, the crops, the woods, the forest, the tools, take the machinery away from the landlords, and carry out searches and arrests. The voice of centuries and fresh experience of the revolution both said to the muzhik that the question of land is a question of power. The agrarian revolution needed the organs of a peasant dictatorship. The muzhik did not yet know this Latin word, but the muzhik knew what he wanted. That anarchy of which the landlords, liberal commissars, and compromised politicians complained was in reality the first stage of the revolutionary dictatorship in the village. Shout out to Captain Olimar up in the live stream for joining. I appreciate you. Yeah, this chapter feels like, Trotsky going over the counter revolution against the peasantry. In the sort of final chapters of Volume 2 that we read a few days ago, Trotsky is going over in detail how the bourgeoisie were trying to maintain the status quo by keeping, the proletariat locked out of the halls of power. And here he's talking about how the peasantry, which is a large, vast swath of the country, are fighting against the landowners, the kulaks, the socialists in name only, from preventing the peasantry from exercising, true democracy by seizing the land, distributing it amongst themselves equally and proportionally, and then creating workers, or in this case, peasant councils, the Zemstvos. So yeah, very interesting what Trotsky's laying out here. I love how, we're reading this book for communist inspiration so that we can have our own revolution in America. But much of this book is actually about counter revolution. I would not be surprised if the CIA, FBI, any of the other alphabet agencies have read this book to learn how to successfully wage counter revolution. This is the thing. The right wing is definitely reading left wing history, left wing theory, left wing praxis, right? They stay tapped in. And unfortunately, a lot of us on the left, because we're being bombarded from the right through all sorts of means of terror, don't have the time to actually read, don't have actually the time. There's a lot of people who identify as Marxists, never read Capital, never read the Manifesto, never read the German ideology. And we don't just, worship and venerate books and pages as if they're sacred tomes, right? I believe you can have a proper Marxist analysis just by having a good conversation. You know what I mean? Just by doing some basic research and, getting in touch with other people who have studied and done the reading before. I don't believe that's absolutely necessary to have read everything to be consider yourself a communist, a socialist, etc. But I do think it's important. Okay? Yeah. And shout out to the people of Myanmar as well. But that has nothing to do with what we are talking about here. Nothing to do with what we are talking about. Shout out to the people of Myanmar, but that has nothing to do with what we are talking about. Shout out to any socialists or leftists in Myanmar as well. And peace to the Rohingya, the people that originally faced a genocide. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, we have to put some people here in time out. Okay. All right. We have to put some people here out of here as well. I have to put some people out. All right. But once again, for anybody out there to have your question read, to actually engage in the text, I pose to you this question. I pose to you this question. Uh, Once again, should the peasantry be something we focus on in the West? Is there even a peasantry now? I know there are some Marxists out here who actually believe we are in a post-class society. Marxist analysis is still important of capitalism, but his analysis of class is too reductive. That's an argument that some Marxists say. That's one I totally disagree with. But when we talk about you know, the peasantry and the proletariat working in collaboration, is there even still a peasantry to work with? That is a question. That is a serious question I pose to the audience. Do you think the peasantry in modern, Western developed post-industrial nations still exists? Do you think? Anyway, I will continue here. The necessity of creating special, purely peasant organs of land revolution in the localities had been defended by Lenin during the events of 1905 and 1906. The peasant revolutionary committees, he argued, at the Party Congress in Stockholm, present the sole road along which the peasant movement can travel. The muzhiks had not read Lenin, but Lenin knew how to read the mind of the muzhiks. The villages changed their attitudes to the Soviets only in the fall, when the Soviets themselves changed their political course. The Bolshevik and left social revolutionary Soviets in the county or provincial city now no longer held back the peasants, but on the contrary pushed them forward. Whereas during the first months, the villages had looked to the compromisers Soviets for a legal covering, only to come later into hostile conflict with them. Now they first began to find in the revolutionary Soviets a real leadership. The Saratov peasants wrote in September, the power throughout all Russia ought to go to the Soviets of workers, peasants, and soldiers' deputies. That will be safer. Only in the fall did the peasantry begin to join their land program to the slogan of all power to the Soviets. But here too they did not know by whom or how these Soviets were to be led. Agrarian disturbances in Russia had their great tradition, their simple but clear program, their local martyrs and heroes. The colossal experience of 1905 had not passed without leaving its trace in the villages. And to this, we must add the work of these sectarian ideas which had taken hold of millions of peasants. I knew many peasants, writes a well informed author, who accepted the October Revolution as the direct realization of their religious hopes. Of all the peasant revolts known in history, the movement of the Russian peasantry in 1917 was undoubtedly in the highest degree fertilized by political ideas. If nevertheless it proved incapable of creating an independent leadership and taking the power in its own hands, the causes of this are to be found in the organic nature of an isolated, petty, and routine industry. While sucking all the juice out of the muzhik, his economic position did not give him in return the ability to generalize. The political freedom of a peasant means, in practice, the ability to choose between different city parties. But even this choice is not made a priori. The peasantry pushed the Bolshevik toward power with their revolt. But only after conquering the power could the Bolshevik win over the peasantry, converting their agrarian revolution into the laws of a workers' state. A group of investigators, under the guidance of Yakovlev, have made an extremely valuable classification of material, characterizing the evolution of the agrarian movement from February to October. Designating the number of disorganized actions in each month as 100, these investigators have estimated that there were in April 33 organized conflicts, in June 86, in July 120. July was the moment of highest success of the social revolutionary organizations in the country. In August, for 100 disorganized conflicts, there were only 62 organized, and in October, 14. From these figures, wonderfully instructive, although of qualified significance, Yakovlev draws a totally unexpected conclusion. Whereas up to August, he says, the movement has grown steadily more organized. In the fall, it acquired a more spontaneous character. Another investigator, Vremenchev, arrives at the same formula. The lowering of the figure of organized movements in the period of the pre-October waves testifies to the spontaneousness of the movements of those months. If the spontaneous is contrasted to the conscious as blindness to eyesight, and that is the only scientific contrast, then we must come to the conclusion that the consciousness of the peasant movement increased up to August, and then began to fall rapidly, enough to disappear completely at the moment of the October insurrection. But this, our investigators obviously did not wish to say. Taking a somewhat reflective attitude to the question, it is not difficult to understand, for example, that the peasant elections to the Constituent Assembly, in spite of their externally organized character, were incomparably more spontaneous, that is, thoughtless, sheep like, blind, than the disorganized peasant campaigns against the landlord, where each peasant knew quite well what he wanted. In the autumn crisis, the peasants did not abandon conscious action for spontaneous, but abandoned compromisist leadership for the civil war. The decline in organization was really a superficial feature. The compromisist organization fell away, but what it left was by no means a vacant space. The peasants came out on the new road under the direct leadership of the most revolutionary elements, the soldiers, sailors, and workers. And entering upon decisive activities, the peasants would quite often call a mass meeting and even take pains that the resolution adopted should be signed by all those living in the same village. In the autumn period of the peasant movement, with its raiding forms, writes a third investigator, Shestakov, what oftenest appears upon the scene is the old peasant assembly. By means of the assembly, the peasants divide the appropriated goods. Through the assembly, they conduct negotiations with the landlord and overseers, with the county commissars, and with punitive expeditions of all kinds. The question why the town committees, which have led the peasants right up to the Civil War, now disappear from the scene, finds no direct answer in these materials, but the explanation comes of itself. A revolution very quickly wears out its organs and implements. Owing to the mere fact that the land committees have been conducting semi peaceful activities, they were bound to seem of little use for direct assaults. And this general cause is supplemented by particular ones no less weighty. In taking the road of open war with the landlord, the peasant knew too well what awaited them in case of defeat. A number of land committees, even without that, were under Kerensky's lock and key. To scatter the responsibility became a tactical need. The Mir offered the most expedient form for this. The customary mutual mistrust of the peasants undoubtedly worked in the same direction. It was a question now of the direct seizure and division of the landlord's goods. Each wanted to take part in this himself, not entrusting his rights to anybody. Thus, the highest tension of the struggle led to a temporary retirement of the representative organs in favor of primitive peasant democracy in the form of the assembly and communal decree. This crude mistake in defining the character of the peasant movement may seem especially surprising from the pen of Bolshevik investigators, but we must not forget that these are Bolsheviks of the new mold. The bureaucratization of thought was inevitably led to, the bureaucratization of thought has inevitably led to an overvaluing of those forms of organization which were imposed upon the peasant from above, and undervaluing of those which the peasants themselves assumed. The educated functionary, following the liberal professor, looks upon social processes from the point of view of administration. In his position as People's Commissar of Agriculture, Yakovlev subsequently showed the same summary bureaucratic mode of approach to the peasantry, but in an infinitely broader and more responsible sphere, that namely of introducing complete collectivization. Theoretic superficiality takes a cruel revenge when it comes to a practical action on a large scale. But we are still a good 13 years before the mistake of complete collectivization. Okay, so here comes Trotsky coming out against, I guess, Stalin's policy of complete collectivization, the massive state farms, not allowing for, small land ownership or enterprises. I guess that's what he's saying right here. Very interesting. But we are still a good 13 years before the mistake of complete collectivization. It is now only a question of the expropriation of the landed estates. 134,000 landlords are still trembling for their 18 million dessiatines. Most threatened is the situation of those on the summit, the 30,000 lords of old Russia who own 70 million dessiatines, 2,000 on the average per person. A lord, Babaroykin, writes to the Chamberlain Rodzianko, I am a landlord, and somehow it won't fit into my head that I am to be deprived of my land, and that too for a most improbable purpose, for an experimental test of socialist teachings. But it is the task of revolution to accomplish just those things which will not fit into the heads of the ruling class. The more far-sighted landlords cannot help realizing, however, that they will not be able to keep their estates. They are no longer even trying to. The sooner we get rid of our land, they are saying, the better. The Constituent Assembly presents itself to them primarily as a vast clearinghouse where the state will recompense them not only for their land, but also for their anxieties. The peasant landowners adhered to the program of theirs on the left. They were not unwilling to have an end of the parasitical nobility, but they were afraid of unsettling the conception of landed property. The state is rich enough, they declared at their meetings, to pay the landlords something like 12 billion rubles. In the quality of peasants, they were counting on being able to make use of these noble estates once they had been paid for by the people on favorable terms. The proprietors understood that the extent of the indemnity was a political magnitude to be determined by the correlation of forces at the moment of payment. Up to the end of August, there remained a hope that the Constituent Assembly, convoked a la Kornilov, would follow a line of agrarian reform midway between Rodzianko and Milikov. The collapse of Kornilov meant that the possessing classes had lost the game. During September and October, the possessing classes were awaiting the outcome of a hopelessly sick man. During September and October, the possessing classes were awaiting the outcome as a hopelessly sick man awaits death. Autumn with muzhiks is the time for politics. The fields are mowed, illusions are scattered, patience is exhausted, time to finish things up. The movement now overflows its banks, invades all districts, wipes out local peculiarities, draws in all the strata of the villages, washes away all considerations of law and prudence, becomes aggressive, fierce, furious, a raging thing, arms itself with steel and fire, revolvers and hand grenades, demolishes and burns up the manorial dwellings, drives out the landlords, cleanses the earth, and in some places waters it with blood. My God, my God. Trotsky is epic with that pen. He was a beast with that typewriter. My God. Yes, drench the rivers, drench the fields with blood of the landlords, drench the field with the blood of the kulaks. Yes, 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 yes. Gone are the nest of the gentility celebrated by Pushkin. Gone are the nest of the gentility celebrated by Pushkin, Turgenev, and Tolstoy. The old Russia has gone up in smoke. The liberal press is a collection of groans and outcries about the destruction of English gardens, of paintings from the brushes of serfs, of patrimonial libraries, the Parthenons of Tambov, the riding horses, the ancient engravings, the breeding bulls. Bourgeois historians have tried to put the responsibility upon the Bolsheviks for the vandalism of the peasants' mode of settling accounts with the culture of his lords. In reality, the muzhik was completing a business entered upon many centuries before the Bolsheviks appeared in the world. He was fulfilling his progressive historic task with the only means at his disposal. With revolutionary barbarism, he was wiping out the barbarism of the Middle Ages. Moreover, neither he nor himself nor his grandfather, nor his great-grandfather before him ever saw any mercy or indulgence. Oh, this is the closest. This is the closest we will come to Trotsky or any Marxist analyzing the Haitian Revolution or of the many various slave revolts that happened throughout the Americas where black men took up arms to fight against their oppressors. Because essentially what Trotsky is saying here, the serfs were slaves. The Russian peasantry were slaves for many years. We know that the word for slave comes from Slav. Essentially, the Slavic peoples were the slaves of Europe for many, many years. And what he is saying is that now, when the peasantry rises up and drenches the field with the blood of their former landlords, the former possessing classes, it is brutal, historic destiny come to fruition. The slave will eventually overturn his master, kill his master, hang his master, and expropriate the wealth from his master. Is this not inspiring? It especially touches me as somebody who is a big fan of reading about slave revolts in the Americas, hearing about, masters getting killed in their bedrooms, them picking up the baby and smacking it on the wall. You get what I'm saying? All for liberty as they break the chains. I find this to be so inspiring. And this is the type of shit I love. I love it. I love hearing about the comeuppance of our enemies. I love hearing about our enemies getting that pike up their ass. You know what I'm saying? I love this. I love it. Absolutely. Absolutely inspiring. Anyway, when the feudal landlords got the best of the Jacquerie Four and a half centuries before the liberation of the French peasants, a pious monk wrote in his chronicle, they did so much evil to the country that there was no need of the coming of the English to destroy the kingdom. These never could have done what was done by the nobles of France. Only the bourgeoisie in May 1871 proved able to exceed the French nobles in ferocity. The Russian peasants, thanks to the leadership of the workers and the Russian workers, thanks to the support of the peasants, avoided learning this twofold lesson from the defenders of culture and humanity. Okay? So, Mishra says Christianity destroyed the culture and identity of blacks during the colonial era to now. Sure, Mishra, but because you came with the swastika, we're going to have to kick you out. You will never be welcomed here. And yes, I know that the swastika is a ancient religious symbol of Hinduism, but in this modern day and age, putting it in your profile pic gives more red flags than actually a sign of you appreciating some religious or cultural heritage. So yeah, you gotta go. Do not come around here again. I never want to see you again, even though your comment was somewhat true. Somewhat true. I do believe Christianity was used as a weapon of psychological war against enslaved people from Africa in the Americas. Yes, but do not come around here with swastikas. You will instantly get kicked out. We have no tolerance for Nazis and fascists. We want total Nazi death. I want every single Nazi and fascist in the world to be executed. Period. Okay? All right, let's continue here. From the defenders of culture and humanity. All right. The interrelations between the fundamental classes of Russia at large were reproduced in the village, just as the workers and soldiers went into a fight with the monarchy, contrary to the plans of the bourgeoisie. So the peasant poor rose boldest of all against the landlord, not heeding the warnings of the kulak, just as the compromisers believed that the revolution would stand firmly on its feet only from the moment it was recognized by Milikov. So the middle peasants, glancing round to right and left, imagined that the signature of the kulak would legitimize these seizures. And finally, somewhat as the bourgeoisie, although hostile to the revolution, did not hesitate to appropriate the power, so the kulaks, after resisting the raids, did not refuse to enjoy their fruits. The power did not remain long in the hands of the bourgeoisie, nor the landlord's chattels in the hands of the kulaks, for like reasons. The strength of the agrarian democratic and essentially bourgeois revolution was manifested by the fact that it overcame for a time the class contradictions of the village. The farmhand helped the kulak in raiding the landlord. The 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries of Russian history climbed up on the shoulders of the 20th and bent it to the ground. The weakness of this belated bourgeois revolution was manifested in the fact that the peasant war did not urge the bourgeois revolutionists forward, but threw them back conclusively into the camp of reaction. Cesarelli, the hard labor convict of yesterday, defended the estates of the landlords against anarchy. The peasant revolution, thus rejected by the bourgeoisie, joined hands with the industrial proletariat. So this is the final paragraph right here. If you have any comments or questions, it's open discussion time as we end our reading for the day. If you have any comments or questions, put them in the chat. I will try to read them before we close up this live stream after I read this final paragraph. In this way, the 20th century not only got free of those past centuries hanging upon it, but climbed up on their shoulders to a new historic level. In order that the peasant might clear and fence his land, the worker had to stand at the head of the state. That is the simplest formula for the October Revolution. So yeah, what Trotsky is saying here is essentially that the peasantry is essential for a revolution to be successful, and the Bolsheviks willingly really wanted the peasantry on their side. And the peasantry was naturally going to be on the side of the Bolsheviks because the Bolsheviks' demands were for the expropriation of land from the landlords and the kulaks, et cetera, et cetera. However, the peasantry without the workers is not sufficient. And the workers without the peasants is not sufficient, just the way both of them are insufficient without the soldiers being on their side as well. So that's what I'm taking from that. Very, very interesting. It actually really fucking turned me on. I got a fucking chub. I got a fucking hard on reading about these stories of peasants breaking into the landlord's house, expropriating his land, smacking up the nuns. That shit actually fucking turns me on. I like hearing about that shit a whole lot because hopefully I can see that happen in my lifetime, that we expropriate the land from the bourgeois, okay? That we expropriate the land from the billionaires and capital interest and owners of our society who have us all held hostage. That shit turns me the fuck on in a very, very, very erotic way. But yeah, that's all I got to say. We're going to go to the comments here. Can you comment on Bishop Eddie Long and his what? Okay, that's not a comment. Okay, so once again, this is a troll who shall be banished to the gulag. Get on the train. We're going to send you to Siberia. You're going to make big rocks into little rocks for the rest of your life. We will never see you around here again until you are in a small little casket that we will piss on. We will piss on your casket. Okay, but yeah, let's close up the stream. So, for the horizontal live stream, we had the poll question: has your opinion or knowledge of the Russian Revolution changed since reading this book? Just joined, but fuck Trump and MAGA got 100% of the vote. Okay, let's go to the vertical live stream as well. Check in on that. Let's check in on the vertical live stream. See what the people are saying here. Okay. For the poll, we had here, how do you identify? We have 52% with fuck Trump and MAGA. They're unsure. Left anarchists had 26%. Dem socialists at 15%. And 7% with communists with 27 votes. I like those results. I like those results in general. Did not know that there were so many anarchists out here. But I think anarchism is just popular because a lot of people don't know anything about anarchism. So there isn't a lot of tinge or stain on the anarchist name, unlike communists and socialists, which we are permanently fighting against, right? You're permanently fighting against negative press when you are a, unironic communist. So, but I digress. Anyway, this has been a very interesting and fun read. Thank you for joining. Looking forward to seeing you all in our next live stream. I don't know if it will be today or tomorrow, but we are making good progress on this book. Once again, we are, nearing the end. We are in volume 3 of Trotsky's history. We're going to knock this out pretty soon, probably in, by the first week of July. For the first full week of July, we should be done. We only have about, 7 or 8 more chapters to go. Looking forward to reading this all with you and getting great commentary in the comment section. and also, seeing some more people become radicalized, because that's the whole point of this. So y'all be easy out there. All power to the people, and peace.